Hi, I'm Steve Clemons, and I have a question. What can Gaza's past tell us about its future? Let's get to the bottom line. For decades, Gaza has been the #1 hotspot between Palestinians and Israelis, and it has seen so much death and destruction. But it's so much more than today's headlines. For starters, Gaza is literally thousands of years old. Sitting at the crossroads between Africa and Asia, it's always been a vibrant trading city, and empires have fought over it, including the Pharaohs, the Persians, the Greeks, the Arabs, and the Crusaders. Now, as Israel reduces the Gaza Strip to rubble, killing and maiming tens of thousands of Palestinians after Hamas's surprise attack in October, what's going to become of it? Have Israel's attempts to seal it off from the rest of the world really worked? And will the United States and Israel ever recognize the central role it plays in the Palestinian struggle? Today, we're talking with Jean-Pierre Filiu, a long-serving French diplomat and government advisor who is now a professor of Middle East Studies at Sciences Po in Paris. And he's author of Gaza, A History. Thank you so much for joining us. Let me just start with your book and what possessed you 10 years ago to identify Gaza as a rich topic to study and to write this book of its history?
First, thank you so much for your very kind invitation. I started thinking about the book decades ago, since my first visit to Gaza was as early as 1980. And I came back and back during the first Intifada, after the Intifada, the second Intifada after, and having these projects of showing that the Strip, the Gaza territory, how Gaza territory became a strip, was contrary to all its history. That the history of Gaza as an oasis, as a crossroad, as you just mentioned, was essential. And that going against this very rich history was going against the nature of Gaza and, of course, against the future of its population.
You describe Gaza in its historical true form as a place that was lush, that was prosperous, that was a trading, essentially a trading state, essentially a very, very different picture. Could you give our audience some understanding of the many thousands of years that Gaza had a very, very different role and, sensibility, if you will, between now and what used to be?
It was basically an oasis at the outlet of the Wadi Raza, the Gaza Valley, to the Mediterranean Sea, and it was a commercial hub between Africa and Asia, but also the Mediterranean outlet for the caravans coming from the Arabian Peninsula. And this is how Gaza came to be known as Hashem's Gaza, Raza to Hashem in Arabic, because at the beginning of the 6th century of our era, Hashem ibn Abd al-Manaf, one of the great-grandfathers of Prophet Muhammad, died in Gaza while he was running a caravan from the so-called Happy Arabia Felix, because Gaza was key as a trading post for all the products that were coming from this part of Arabia. So this is how it developed. It developed, of course, as a strategic outpost that was at the center of the rivalries of all the local empires and kingdoms, but also at the same time as a trading post, a commercial hub, literally a huge caravanserai, a huge khan. And even the city today, Khan Yunis, that is at the center of so bloody and bitter battles, Khan Yunis was built in the 14th century by a Mamluk emir or commander, Yunus Nawruzi, and it was named after him, Khan Yunis, because it was a khan, it was a huge commercial building that expanded into a full-fledged city. So Khan Yunis, like the rest of the Gaza area, was basically a crossroad, a trading area, and sometimes even a free trade area, a free trade zone for the competing powers in the area.
So Jean-Pierre, for 4,000 years, what I'm understanding from you is Gaza mattered. It was on the map. nations were trading with it. Intrigue was happening there. It was an oasis. For the last couple of decades, Gaza has been getting the message it doesn't matter, that Palestine can be an issue that's shoved under the rug. Tell us about the tension, historical tension, between Gaza that used to matter so significantly and Gaza being told, sorry, we don't even want to pay attention to the Israel-Palestine issue.
Well, the key, of course, and the link between what happened in 1948 and today is, of course, the ongoing Nakba, the catastrophe, the collective denial of the Palestinian aspirations. And this is how Gaza, the oasis, the crossroad, became the Gaza Strip. Just think about this word, the strip. It's a strip of land. It's what was left after the war of independence from the Israeli point of view, the war of Palestine from the Arab point of view, the first Israeli-Arab war from the historian point of view of 1948, 1949. And when the war stopped in January 1949, the strip was left. It was the only strip left of what was British Mandate Palestine, what was Arab Palestine, because 77% of it had become Israel, and 22% of it had been annexed by the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan. So the Gaza Strip under Egyptian authority was in fact the only strip left of Arab Palestine, and Egypt didn't want to annex it. So that was the first reality that made Gaza so central from the Palestinian issue. But the other one was that Gaza had become, through the Nakba, through the mass exodus of the Palestinian population, the home to 25% of the whole Arab population of Palestine, concentrated on 1% of its former territory. So the Palestinians in Gaza call it Noah's Ark, our Noah's Ark, because from all over Palestine, not only from the south, they had sought and found shelter in Gaza, even in very difficult conditions. So this is how Gaza became so central to Palestine. And this centrality, as a historian, I was struck by the fact that it was not fully taken into account by the Palestinian historiography, that was more centered on Jerusalem, of course, or on the refugees in the diaspora, but not on the refugees that stayed on the very land of Palestine, meaning Gaza.
Now, in 1948, as I understand it, Prime Minister of Israel David Ben-Gurion wanted to allow 100,000 of the Palestinian refugees who fled to Gaza to go back to their villages. What was happening there at that point?
It was immediately after the ceasefire when, for the first and only time, the United Nations organized in Switzerland, in the city of Lausanne, a comprehensive peace conference in order to settle all the aspects of the Israeli-Arab dispute. And the most pressing issue was the fate of the refugees. So in order for Israel to deal with such an issue, David Ben-Gurion proposed that 100,000 refugees from the Gaza Strip would be resettled into what had become the territory of Israel. This was an unprecedented offer, and in fact, the last one of such a kind. But it generated a huge debate in Israel because there was a very strong denial of any return of the refugees. But the Israeli precondition was for Gaza to be annexed by Israel. That was what proposed Ben-Gurion to settle, quote unquote, the whole issue. So it was refused by the Arab states, and especially Egypt, that had fought so much and lost so many lives to protect the Gaza Strip. And that was the end of it. But what is interesting, and what Israeli leaders and world leaders should remember, is that Ben-Gurion, the founder of the State of Israel, understood from day one that Gaza, because of a concentration of Palestinian refugees in the southwest corner of Israel, represented a challenge that had to be dealt with. And since 1949, Israel tried everything with Gaza and failed. And I'm afraid that despite, or probably because of the magnitude of the destruction that is going on right now, it will fail again, because the answer to Gaza is the answer to be given to the Palestinian question.
You've written a recent foreign affairs article called Why Gaza Matters, and I recommend it to everyone to read this. In this article, Jean-Pierre, you talk about Gaza in part by the design of Israeli policy has become the hub, the key hub of Palestinian nationalism. And that much of what we've seen and the tension we've seen was by Israel's own design and creation in terms of the policies it took. So how does the future look, and how do you take Gaza, where you argue it's the key to peace and prosperity, to become something to get in a different equation right now? When you look at the importance of Palestinian nationalism as you've written it, and you say it's in Gaza. You're not talking about Ramallah, you're talking about Gaza.
Yes, Gaza is central, and you're very right to underline that even some Palestinian leaders, some Ramallah-based leaders, for years didn't give much attention to Gaza. They were in fact quite relieved, I must admit, that in 2007, Hamas took over Gaza, and they got rid of what they described as a load. They didn't realize how important it was for them. Mahmoud Abbas, who had been elected president by the Palestinian people just 2 years before, he should have come to Gaza after that, say, I don't want Gaza to be separated from the rest of Palestine. And that was not the case. So there was this denial of Palestinian centrality by Israel, but also the denial of Gaza centrality by most of the Palestinian leadership. And this, of course, has to stop if we don't want the cycle to repeat, and each repetition will be more violent, more bloody than the previous one. As a historian, I counted 15 Israeli wars on Gaza since 1948. All those wars were won, quote unquote, militarily by Israel, but they were all lost politically except one, the first Intifada, because the first Intifada triggered the peace dynamics in Israel that in 1992 brought to power Yitzhak Rabin with a top priority to disengage the Israeli army from Gaza. But instead of looking for military solutions, he looked for political solutions. And that was the beginning of the so-called peace process and the Oslo agreements. So that means that people have to think totally differently among the Israeli and the Palestinian leadership, of course, but among the international community, because it's impossible to say that, okay, the war will be over, then we will rebuild, then we start. No. Gaza cannot be besieged anymore. It's impossible. First, it's an insult to humanity, but also it's a recipe for disaster, because everything that has been happening has been built on the blockade of Gaza for 16 years by Israel, with the collaboration of Egypt in the south. And this is this blockade that literally consolidated Hamas' grip on Gaza. And if we don't want the same thing to happen worst, then of course different policy has to be followed, and Gaza has to be open to the world the way it was and the way it has been, not only for centuries, but for millenniums, and for the whole benefit of the region, not only for Gaza and its inhabitants.
You talk in your article, Jean-Pierre, about a very beautiful different vision that might have taken place, I should underscore, if James Wolfenson had had his way. It was a $3 billion development plan in the 1990s, thought about for Gaza. James Wolfenson was president of the World Bank, and this was undermined by Ariel Sharon, the Prime Minister of Israel. It was undermined by other forces. But you talk about the importance of getting back to that kind of thinking, of returning Gaza to a prosperous, major economic hub. Is there any prospect of that happening as you see it? And because you talk about it being the way forward, but who's going to do that?
Well, again, I'm just a historian in my office in Paris, but I can see that if Mr. Wolfenson, former head of the World Bank, found reasonable in 2005 to put forward a $3 billion plan to develop Gaza, and not only to do that, but to invest, I understand, $500,000 of his own money, several millions of his friends' money into a project to rehabilitate the greenhouses of the Israeli settlements in order to give them to the Palestinians in 2005. The whole project was smashed not only by Sharon, but by the scorchers policy of the settlers who burned down everything. But if those people with this connection, with this experience, were ready to bet so much money on that, I think it was quite a fair bet, because the amount of the money that will be spent for merely reconstructing what is actually being destroyed under our very eyes will be far worse. It will be, I don't know, 5, 10, I heard incredible, mind-boggling figures just to rebuild what existed. And what existed is not sustainable, Palestinian people in Gaza have the right to have a future, to have an horizon, and this horizon has to be open. And this horizon being open will open, I'm absolutely convinced of that, the horizon for the whole region, for the Israeli-Palestinian peace process, but also for the Israeli-Arab relations.
You were a diplomat and an advisor for successive French governments for 2 decades. What would be your advice to not only France, but to other governments as they look at this crisis today and as we try to look forward?
Well, at this very moment, I just speak in an academic capacity. I have not any official or non-official status. It's over. But I'm convinced that Europe, United Europe, has a key role to play. Not because we should wish it or because of a vision grander, but because it's a very clear challenge. Because for Europe, and we didn't mention that, but there is a connection between the war in Ukraine and the war in the Middle East. And Putin is playing on both theaters very cleverly. And in order for the Ukrainian front, if I might call it, not to be more threatened, well, the war in Gaza has not only to be stopped, but a peace dynamics have to start. And European Union is a main trade partner of Israel, is a main donor to the Palestinian Authority. It has leverage on both instance, but what is more important from the European point of view, and I want to stress that, is that in the previous decade, we saw how much Europe paid when it turned a blind eye from a Middle Eastern crisis that supposedly United States of America or others were handling, quote unquote. That was the Syrian revolution that turned into a bloody war that the Assad regime launched on his own people. So Europe didn't want to get involved, and the result was the so-called refugee crisis of 2015 and the jihadi terror wave that followed. So Europe has a key vested, I would even say vital interest in settling the issue and in being involved in Gaza, because at this moment, both leaderships in Israel and in the Palestinian arena do not have the energy to promote such a vision. They are engulfed in their present tactics. They are not even strategies, and they need a foreign power to take charge. And because, I'm sorry to say, America abdicated its vision for peace by letting this catastrophe happen day after day without any vision for the day after. Because of that, the European Union, for its own sake, has to step in.
I'm just wondering, does this one feel different? More than 100 Gaza heritage sites have been damaged or destroyed. You've got the Great Omari Mosque, the Church of St. Phosphorus, which is thought to be the third oldest church in the world, destroyed. 2,000-year-old Roman cemetery, Rafah Museum. These are cultural and historic sites. Is there something else, in your sense, going on in this conflict that's different than others?
Well, first, as you just mentioned, the magnitude of the destruction. All the sites you mentioned had lived through centuries of wars, invasions, occupation, without being damaged at such a degree. So it's already this that really is appalling, because it's part of the memory of humanity that is vanishing in front of our eyes. But what is certainly more important, there is an Arabic saying, "El-Bashar qabla al-Hajar," the human being before the stones, even the historical stones, is of course the women and men of Gaza. And the catastrophe is already exceeding everything that Palestine has endured. Compared to the Nakba, the 1948 Nakba, and the mass exodus of the Palestinian population, you had all over the year of 1948, 13,000 Palestinians killed, more or less. Now we are at 23,000, probably more. So already the number, but also the proportion, because it was 1% of the Palestinian population at that time, and now 1% of the population of Gaza has been killed. And there's absolutely no indication that it's going to stop. Even when it comes to the exodus of the Nakba was 750,000 plus Palestinians being forced out of their homes. Now you have nearly 2 billion people who have been forced inside Gaza. So officially they are internally displaced, but in fact they are refugees, second wave refugees, third wave refugees, fourth wave refugees, because sometimes they have been moving from place to place. It is absolutely horrendous. The magnitude of the tragedy is unprecedented.
Well, thank you so much for helping us to understand the history of Gaza as a great oasis in this region's history. Thank you so much, French historian Jean-Pierre Filiu. Thank you for being with us today. So what's the bottom line? After World War II, diplomats and generals from around the world created the United Nations. They launched the Marshall Plan to rebuild Europe. And they turned the occupation of Japan into a rewiring of that nation's politics, its economy, and even national psyche. Traumatic times force us to rethink, to recalibrate, and redesign. And that will happen with Gaza as well, whether the West likes it or not. Israel has quashed previous attempts at economic development in Gaza. But for thousands of years, Gaza has been a prosperous and lush crossroad between North Africa and the Levant. Helping Gaza to become what it has always been is the kind of creative thinking that turns a nightmare into a thriving and robust economy, and a state that Palestinians will one day be able to cherish and celebrate. Sure, there's a long road ahead, but that's a vision that rhymes with history. And that's the bottom line.